Hello and welcome to lesson 23. In this lesson we'll talk about the firewall. After explaining the core components of the RHEL 7 firewall configuration, you will learn how to set up a firewall with Firewall D using the Firewall CMD command. Then you'll work in a short exercise on setting up a firewall yourself. I will summarize the topics reviewed in this lesson and we'll be ready to go on to the next lesson. So let's have a look at Firewall D. So in the Linux kernel, there's netfilter. And netfilter is a firewalling functionality that has always been around. Now in older versions of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, to manage it, there was IP tables. In RHEL 7, you could still use IP tables, but it's not the default management interface anymore. The default management interface is Firewall D. And you should make a choice here. And I think the choice is obvious. It's towards the future. And the future is Firewall D anyway. So skip IP tables and concentrate on Firewall D. The design purpose of Firewall D was to make it really easy. And you will notice during this lesson that indeed it is really easy. To work with Firewall D, you have interfaces. And each interface you will assign to a zone. That can be a private zone for your private network in which almost nothing is filtered. It can be a public zone for a server that is connected directly to the internet. Or it can be a demilitarized zone, for example. So that would be the first thing to start with, to assign your interfaces to zones. And next, you need to connect services to zones. And really that makes it very easy because many services are available by default, and you will learn in the latest sub-lesson of this lesson that configuring your own services really is easy to do. And once you have configured these services and made them available, there's just a couple of easy to use command line utilities that you can use to build your own firewall. And you will learn that in the next sub-lesson.
To configure the Linux kernel firewall on Red Hat Enterprise Linux 7, you will use Firewall D. You can still use the old method, which is IP tables, but IP tables really isn't a recommended way, and that is because many utilities write directly to Firewall D. So to make sure that everything is compatible, use Firewall D and nothing else. So to make sure the service is running, you type systemctl status Firewall D, which shows me that on this system it is running. In case it wouldn't be running, you can start it by typing systemctl start firewall D, and next make sure to enable it by typing systemctl enable firewall D. But we don't have to do that here. So to add rules to the firewall, there are a couple of commands. There is Firewall CMD, which is a command line utility, and there is Firewall config, which gives you a graphical interface in which you can click to add services. So the basic concepts in Firewall D are zones and services. So let's do Firewall CMD -- and get zones. You will notice, by the way, that Firewall CMD commands, if you want to get configuration, you type -- and get followed by the thing you want to get, like in this case zones or get services, if you wanted to have an overview of the services that are available. But let's get back to the zones. We want to check which actually is the default zone. So that would be get default zone. So it actually is home. You can imagine what you need to do if you want to set the default zone. Well, you just type set default zone followed by the name of the default zone you want to be using. So if you want to add services to a zone, you will use the -- add services command. But before doing that, it is good to understand what exactly a service is. Basically, a service is a name that is associated to a protocol and a port. I'm already in the etc firewall D services directory, which is the directory where an administrator would create his own services. You can see there's one service existing, which is sender.xml, which is something that I created myself. Now the default system services are in user lib firewall D services. I type ls here and I see an overview of everything I need service-wise. So let's have a look at something that might be a bit complicated, like high availability. I picked this on purpose because high availability is a collection of ports. Some services need multiple ports. You can see there's a short name, there's a description, and there's a collection of ports, which is just a list of all the ports with the related protocol that you want to be open. Another complicated service, for example, is samba.xml, which is also a collection of ports. And what you can also see is that for this service some specific kernel modules have to be loaded. In order to do that, just type module name equals followed by the name of the kernel modules that you need to load. So if you wanted to create your own service, well, it's very easy. Just make sure you have an XML file with a service tag and a short description and a description and a port definition, which consists of a protocol and an associated port. And yeah, by the way, the other files had protocol first and then port. The order really doesn't matter. So if you want to add a service, the way to do that is firewall cmd -- zone equals home -- add service equals high availability, and it tells me we have success. So let's type firewall cmd -- list all to get the configuration for the current zone. So in firewall cmd -- list all, you can specify the zone you want to be working in. If in any firewall cmd command you don't specify the zone, it just takes the default zone as a starting point. So in here you can see that high availability has been added. Now this wasn't too hard, but you should remember one thing: everything that you add in this way will persist until reboot only. So if you want to make it a permanent setting, well, just repeat the last command followed by the -- permanent option. That makes it successful, and that means that also after a reboot of this system the service will get back. Now this was a firewall cmd command. It's a fairly easy to use command, but it has long options and it is easy to make mistakes while working with it. Fortunately, there's also firewall config, which is a graphical utility, which is just very convenient to work with. You can select the zone from here, and in each zone you have a list of services. Just click the service that you want to be using to open it. Now you should be aware that there's a configuration which by default is set to runtime. So the runtime configuration will be applied immediately, but it will be lost once you restarted the firewall D service. If you want to make it permanent, click permanent and make sure to select the services that you want to be using on your firewall.
So now that you know how to configure a firewall, let's do an exercise. In the exercise, I would like you to configure a NetFilter firewall using the Firewall CMD utility and make sure this firewall meets the following requirements. It uses the DMZ zone and it allows traffic in the zone to SSH, NTP, FTP, VNC, Apache and DNS. And that should give you a working firewall to protect your system properly. That's all for the exercise.
In the exercise I ask you to use the firewall cmd command to put some services in a new zone. Now I want you to be aware that if this would be the exam, you don't have to use firewall cmd, you can just use firewall config, because it's a very easy and convenient way to add things to your firewall. So let's have a look again at what was in the exercise. We need to configure a firewall using the firewall cmd utility and make sure this firewall meets the following requirements. It uses the DMZ zone. So firewall cmd get default zone is what we need first. It tells us that we have the home zone. And we need to change that, so minus set default zone followed by DMZ would set the DMZ zone. So to add the services to the firewall, you need a firewall cmd add service. But that's not enough, because this would add it runtime only and you want to make it permanent. So type permanent in front of it. And next type add service followed by the name of the service that you want to add. Now the problem with add service is that it takes one argument only. So SSH and not a list SSH, NTP, FTP. But fortunately it is relatively easy to repeat the last command. So we do this for every single service. Oops, so there is no VNC service. Let's have a look. Firewall cmd get services gives us a list of everything that is configured as a service. And you can see that the name is VNC-server and not VNC. And then we need Apache as well, which obviously is not going to be Apache but HTTP. And finally there is DNS, and that's also one to be aware of, that it is DNS and it is not named. So DNS, and that should be it. Now to check, we want to do firewall cmd list all. So hey, why is this showing just SSH? Well, that is because I have added the configuration as a permanent configuration and not as a runtime configuration. Of course, I could repeat all of these commands to make them a runtime as well, but I can also do systemctl restart firewall d. And now we do a list all, and we can see that all the services have been added. And this is exactly the way you want to be working on the exam, because on the exam you don't want to add the services runtime only. You must make sure that the services get back once you restart your server. And that's all I wanted you to do in the exercise. Now what might be useful as well is if you type firewall config to check the configuration. So we have been using the DMZ zone, which you can see has been selected by default, and the DMZ zone is showing us everything that we've just added. So this is enough, and this concludes the exercise.
So this brings us to the end of lesson 23. In this lesson you have learned how to set up a firewall using firewall D and the firewall cmd command. I hope you found it not too difficult, but it's organized in a very logical way. If you just know how to use services and zones, you basically get everything you need to pass the firewall questions on the RHCSA exam.